The alliance is dead. For over 150 years, the border between the United States and Canada was the quietest, most stable geographic line on the planet. It was more than just a boundary, it was a promise of shared defense, integrated economies, and a friendship so deep it was taken for granted. But on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2026, that promise didn't just break, it was incinerated on live television. Donald Trump didn't use a memo. He didn't use a midnight tweet or a diplomatic cables. He walked out to a podium in the Rose Garden, flanked by the high brass of the Pentagon and the Department of Energy, and did the unthinkable. He didn't refer to Mark Carney as the Prime Minister of Canada. He called him, quote, the future former governor of the great state of Canada. That one sentence was a calculated, precision guided strike at the heart of Canadian sovereignty. But he wasn't done. With the world watching in stunned silence, the President of the United States publicly demanded that the democratically elected leader of America's biggest trading partner resign immediately. Mark Carney should step down today, Trump said, his voice echoing through every capital in the world. We need a leader in Ottawa who wants to work with America, not a globalist who wants to sell North American energy to the highest bidder in Beijing. As long as he remains in power, the United States is officially out of the business of diplomacy with Canada. In an instant, the world order we've known since the end of the Second World War vanished. This isn't just a rough patch in relations. This is a total systemic rupture. We are talking about the most significant diplomatic crisis in North American history, and the fallout didn't wait for the morning papers. Within 60 seconds of those words being spoken, the global markets went into a vertical dive. The Dow Jones plummeted 1,200 points. Why? Because the markets aren't stupid. They know that the US and Canada are not two separate economies. They are one giant integrated machine. And Donald Trump just threw a massive wrench into the gears. But here is the detail that is currently sending a cold shiver through every home in the American North. This isn't just about hurt feelings in Ottawa. It's about the fact that your lights are powered by Canada, your car runs on Canada, and your home is heated by Canada. While the news cycles were arguing about the governor insult, the actual energy grid was starting to collapse. See, most Americans don't realize how deep this dependency goes. Canada provides roughly 60% of all crude oil imports to the United States, 60%. That oil flows through a massive network of pipelines into refineries in Michigan, Illinois, and Indiana. If that flow stops, even for a week, the American Midwest doesn't just see high gas prices, it sees dry pumps. It sees the total halt of the trucking industry. But it gets even more localized and more terrifying in the Northeast. New England, New York, and the border states aren't just buying extra electricity from Canada. They're hooked to the Quebec and Ontario hydro grids like an umbilical cord. We are talking about 20 to 30% of the entire power supply for states like Vermont and Maine. Within 48 hours of Trump's resignation demand, the first energy emergency was declared, not in Canada, but in the United States. The response from Ottawa was unlike anything we have seen in our lifetimes. Usually, when Washington barks, Ottawa tries to de escalate. Not this time. Mark Carney didn't call for a reset. He didn't ask for a meeting. Instead, the Canadian government effectively pulled the plug. Within 48 hours, reports began surfacing that energy exports were being throttled for national inventory assessment. That is diplomatic code for, you wanted to play hardball, we're taking our power back. The energy guillotine is real and it's dropping. In Maine, utility companies began warning of rolling demand-side management. In plain English, that means blackouts are coming. In Michigan, the price of heating oil surged by 40% in a single afternoon. This is the 4-8-hour energy shock. It is the moment when the abstract concept of geopolitics becomes the very real reality of a cold house and a car you can't afford to drive. But you have to understand the timing of this. This isn't happening in a vacuum. Just weeks ago, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down Trump's previous emergency tariffs, ruling that he didn't have the authority to tax the world under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Most people thought the trade war was over. They thought the courts had checked the president's power. They were wrong. Trump didn't retreat. He pivoted. He moved from trade policy to regime change. By demanding Carney's resignation, Trump has transformed a fight over money into a fight over identity. He is betting that the economic pain will force Canadians to turn on their own leader. But he forgot the first rule of North American history. Nothing unites Canadians faster than a threat from the South. While the White House was expecting a surrender, they got a sovereignty resolution. As we move into the next section, we are going to look at the I don't work for you speech. This was the moment that turned a prime minister into a national symbol and left Washington speechless. Because while Trump was treating Canada like a branch office, Mark Carney was preparing to show him exactly what happens when you try to fire a man who doesn't answer to you. The energy crisis was just the opening act. The real battle is for the very idea of what it means to be a sovereign nation in 2006. Washington expected a white flag. They expected a frantic diplomatic mission to D.C., a series of late-night concessions on dairy or lumber, and a prime minister begging for the taps to be turned back on. They thought they were dealing with a trade dispute. But when the doors of the House of Commons in Ottawa opened on Thursday morning, It wasn't a surrender, it was a mobilization. What the world witnessed over the next 12 hours has been dubbed the Maple Spring. For the first time in the 158-year history of the Canadian Confederation, the partisan bickering stopped. The Liberals, the Conservatives, the New Democrats, every single member of the 338-seat chamber stood in total absolute silence as Mark Carney walked to the clerk's table. There were no hecklers. There were no protests. Even the opposition leaders, men and women who had spent years trying to ruin Carney's career, were wearing small pins of the Canadian flag. Trump had intended to create a fracture. Instead, he had forged a diamond. It was a forensic, surgical rejection of foreign interference. He didn't start with trade, he started with history. He reminded the world that Canada isn't a protectorate or a subsidiary. He spoke about the soldiers who had fought alongside Americans from the trenches of Vimy Ridge to the mountains of Kandahar. He spoke about the shared blood and the shared values. And then he looked directly into the camera, directly at the Oval Office, and delivered the line that is now being etched into the national psyche of every democracy on the planet. In Canada, Carney said, his voice level and cold, leaders are not chosen by foreign press conferences. We are not a department of the United States government. We are a sovereign people. And while we value our friendship with the American people, I have a message for their president. He paused, letting the silence of the chamber weigh down on the broadcast. I don't work for you. The explosion of noise that followed was unprecedented. The chamber erupted into a standing ovation that lasted for nearly 3 minutes. In that moment, Carney ceased being a politician and became the physical embodiment of a nation's backbone. But it wasn't just theater. Within an hour of that speech, the Canadian Parliament held a vote on a sovereignty resolution. This was the Buffett rule in action. Trump had attacked Canada's identity, and the response was total unity. The final tally, 338-0. Not a single member of Parliament voted against it. This is the moment where the crisis shifted from an economic spat to a global precedent. When a G7 nations parliament votes unanimously to reject the influence of a sitting U.S. president, the rules-based order isn't just under pressure, it's gone. But the I don't work for you sentiment didn't stay inside the halls of power. It hit the streets. Within hours, millions of Canadians were flying flags from their balconies. Grocery stores began pulling American products from the shelves voluntarily. It was a grassroots decoupling. But back in Washington, the silence was equally chilling. Trump's response to Carney's defiance was to double down. He ordered the immediate closure of all U.S. consulates in Canada and the recall of the American ambassador. For the first time since the War of 1812, the diplomatic line between the two greatest allies in history went dead. Embassies were shuttered. Consular services for millions of dual citizens were frozen. Families across the border found themselves in a nightmare where they couldn't cross to see sick relatives or attend weddings. Then came the Five Eyes blackout. This is the detail that the mainstream news is missing. The Five Eyes is the most powerful intelligence sharing network in the world. It's how we track terrorists, monitor cyber threats, and keep the North American airspace secure. As part of the sovereignty resolution, Canada placed its intelligence cooperation under immediate strategic review. If Canada stops sharing data with the NSA or the CIA, the United States loses its northern shield. For the first time in decades, the U.S. has a blind spot on its own continent. Journalists began reporting that CSS, Canada's intelligence service, had detected unusual activity near the border. Rumors of cyber probes into the American power grid began to circulate. The narrative in D.C. was that Carney was being aggressive. The narrative in Ottawa was that they were defending their home. This is the identity war. When you tell a nation they are a state or a governor, you aren't just insulting them, you are giving them the moral high ground to do things they would never otherwise consider. Warren Buffett later reflected on this, calling it the ultimate miscalculation. He noted that in any negotiation, you have to leave your opponent a way to save face. By demanding a resignation, Trump left Carney with only two choices: be a traitor or be a hero. He chose to be a hero, and in doing so, he turned the energy crisis into a patriotic duty. Canadians weren't complaining about the loss of trade revenue. They were proud to suffer for sovereignty. As we move into the third section, the economic reality of this pride is about to hit the world. Because while Canada is united, the global markets are realizing that a North America divided is a North America that China and Russia are ready to exploit. The energy guillotine is about to fall, and the sound of it dropping will be heard as far away as Beijing. This isn't just a crisis anymore, it's the beginning of the great decoupling. The geography of North America is a trap that Washington forgot it was in. For decades, the United States operated under the assumption that its energy security was a domestic triumph. But the reality is far more integrated and far more fragile. When Canada pulled the energy guillotine, they didn't just stop selling a product, they effectively paralyzed the American industrial heartland. This is the moment the regime change strategy collided with the brutal laws of physics and logistics. Let's look at the refinery death spiral. The American Midwest states like Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio is home to some of the most complex oil refineries on the planet. But those refineries aren't built for light, sweet Texas oil. They are specifically engineered to process the heavy bitumen that flows south from the Alberta oil sands. It is a locked in relationship. When Canada throttled the pipelines in response to the resignation demand, those refineries couldn't just switch suppliers overnight. You can't put diesel in a jet engine, and you can't put Permian Basin light crude into a heavy oil coker. Within 72 hours, refinery utilization in the Midwest dropped by 30%. Gas prices in Chicago and Detroit didn't just rise, they went to levels that made the 70s look like the good old days. But while the American consumer was staring at $7 a gallon gas, a much more dangerous decoupling was happening on the global stage. This is the part of the story that isn't being talked about on cable news. In geopolitics, there is no such thing as a vacuum. When the US and Canada stop talking, the rest of the world starts moving. In Beijing, the reaction was swift and clinical. While Trump was calling Carney a governor, Chinese trade officials were quietly boarding flights to Ottawa. For years, the United States has relied on Canada for its supply of critical minerals. We're talking about the lithium, cobalt, and nickel that are essential for the Green Revolution, for every EV battery, and for every advanced weapons system in the Pentagon's arsenal. Those minerals were supposed to be the bedrock of a North American fortress economy. Instead, they are now the ultimate bargaining chip. Reports began leaking that Canada had signed an emergency strategic partnership with a Chinese state owned enterprise for the joint development of Arctic mineral deposits. Think about the irony. To protect American workers from a Canadian prime minister, the White House has effectively pushed the world's most resource rich democracy into the arms of its greatest strategic rival. This is the global decoupling in real time. Canada isn't just surviving the crisis, they are reorienting their entire future toward the east. Warren Buffett, watching this from Omaha, issued a warning that cut through the noise. He called it the market for corruption. Buffett argued that the moment you use state power to demand the removal of a sovereign leader, you destroy the certainty premium of the U.S. market. If the president can demand a new leader in Canada, what stops him from demanding a new CEO at Apple or Berkshire Hathaway? For the first time in a century, global investors started to treat the United States as a political risk zone. Capital began flowing out of the dollar and into neutral havens like the Swiss franc and, more alarmingly, the digital yuan. But the most visceral blow came from the skies. Canada controls the most critical airspace for flights traveling between the U.S. and Europe and between the U.S. and Asia. As part of the sovereignty resolution, Canada announced enhanced security screening for all U.S. registered aircraft. This was a bureaucratic strangulation. Flights that usually take 7 hours were suddenly rerouted around Canadian airspace, adding 3 hours and $50,000 in fuel costs to every single journey. Major American airlines began canceling transatlantic routes. The sky-high tax on American travel became the new normal overnight. While the elite were worried about flights, the masses were reacting with a mixture of nationalism and panic. In the American North, a blue state rebellion began to take shape. The governors of Maine, Vermont, and Michigan, the people whose citizens were literally freezing as the Canadian hydropower was cut, held a joint press conference. They didn't stand with the White House. They demanded that the president rescind the resignation demand and restore the grid. For the first time since the 1860s, we saw the emergence of a regional political bloc that was more aligned with a foreign capital than its own. This is the danger of attacking an ally's identity. You don't just alienate the leader, you alienate the people. In Canada, the narrative shifted from Mark Carney's policy to Canadian survival. The masses who had once criticized Carney's economic record were now standing in lines for hours to buy sovereignty bonds to fund the government's energy pivot. They were eating Canadian grown produce and boycotting American brands with a religious fervor. As we move into the final section, the question is no longer whether Carney will resign. He won't. The question is, what is left of the United States' reputation when this is over? The 158-year rupture is complete. The Northern Shield is down, the energy grid is fractured, and the world is watching as the two closest brothers in history become strangers. We are looking at the final reckoning, the moment where the price of America first is measured in the total isolation of the American people. The dust hasn't settled, but the map has changed. We are no longer living in the era of the North American fortress. That dream, the idea that the three nations of this continent would eventually merge into a single unstoppable economic and security bloc, was buried under the weight of a single press conference. What we are witnessing now is the 158-year rupture. It is the final reckoning for a foreign policy that mistook dependency for dominance. The most immediate casualty of this crisis isn't Mark Carney's career. It's the legal and moral foundation of the Western alliance. As Carney stood his ground, the international community didn't just watch. They revolted. 43 nations, led by the European Union and the United Kingdom, issued a joint declaration on democratic integrity. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was a formal condemnation that effectively placed the United States in the same diplomatic category as nations that interfere in foreign elections. The declaration stated that demanding the removal of a democratically elected leader is a violation of the UN Charter and the North Atlantic Treaty itself. In one stroke, the U.S. moved from being the leader of NATO to its primary legal antagonist. But while the diplomats argued, the real world consequences were turning into a domestic nightmare for the White House. The doctrine of universal threat has created a legal trap that is now snapping shut. If the president declares that Canada's leadership is a national security threat, then every joint venture, every cross-border pipeline, and every defense contract is technically illegal. GOP senators from states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, states that depend on just-in-time delivery of Canadian auto parts, are facing a total industrial shutdown. They are no longer worried about the next election. They are worried about the next week. One prominent Republican senator was caught on a hot mic saying, "We told him to squeeze them, not to execute the relationship. My voters can't build trucks without Canadian aluminum, and they can't heat their homes without Canadian gas. We've managed to unite Canada and bankrupt the Midwest in 72 hours. This is the internal revolt that is currently tearing the administration apart. The populist base is realizing that America first doesn't work when America's infrastructure is bolted to a neighbor you just declared war on. And then there is the Arctic Gateway. This is the detail that will haunt American strategists for the next 50 years. For decades, Canada has guarded the Northwest Passage, ensuring it remained a stable, Western-controlled corridor. But as the relationship with Washington collapsed, Ottawa signaled a new Arctic reality. They have begun inviting non-traditional partners to invest in Arctic infrastructure. Reports are surfacing of Russian icebreakers providing escort services for Canadian commercial vessels. The very thing the Pentagon has spent trillions trying to prevent, a Russo-Chinese foothold in the North American Arctic, was handed to them on a silver platter by a diplomatic temper tantrum. Warren Buffett, in his final analysis of the crisis, pointed to the irreversibility of trust. He noted that you can fix a tariff and you can renegotiate a trade deal, but you can never unsay a demand for regime change. The special relationship was built on the quiet understanding that no matter how much we disagreed on dairy or lumber, we would never question each other's right to exist. That understanding is gone. Canada is now building a post-American future. They are fast-tracking the transatlantic Pacific Bridge, a trade architecture that connects Ottawa directly to London, Tokyo, and Brussels, bypassing the US dollar and US ports. So, where does this end? The forecast for the next 90 days is a landscape of lawsuits and leverage. The "I don't work for you" speech has become the blueprint for other middle power nations. If Canada can stand up to a superpower and survive, why can't Mexico? Why can't Brazil? The unipolar moment didn't end with a war in the Pacific or a collapse in the Middle East. It ended at a press conference in the Rose Garden. We are looking at a North America that is now two separate islands. One is a superpower trying to rediscover its self-sufficiency through isolation. The other is a middle power that just discovered its own strength through defiance. The energy grid may eventually be restored and the embassies may one day reopen, but the special relationship is a ghost. In the end, the moment that will define this entire century of North American history isn't the 100% tariff. It isn't even the energy blackout. It's those 5 words spoken by a prime minister who was supposed to be a governor. 5 words that reminded the world that you can buy a product and you can bully a market, but you cannot own a democracy. I don't work for you. As those words continue to echo from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico, the question for every American remains, was the pride of a demand worth the price of a partner? The 158-year friendship is over. The final reckoning has begun. And as the lights flicker in the American North, we are all left staring into the dark, wondering how we managed to lose the only neighbor who truly had our back.